Hi there, welcome to another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. It's November 8th, 2021. I'm Kathleen Newman, and this is A Man, a Horse-Drawn Wagon, and a Moving Panorama, The Travels of L.E. Emerson with Peter Morelli. Peter Morelli of Portland has been involved in panorama research, exhibition, and performance since the 1996 rediscovery of the Pilgrims' Progress moving panorama in Saco. He presented at the 2004 International Panorama Council Conference on that panorama and on a successful plan to conserve, exhibit, and perform it. He was a trustee of the Saco Museum and Dyer Library Association when he assisted the staff. He presented on Emerson's diary at the International Panorama Council's annual conference in September. The former director of development and city planner for the city of Saco, Peter was responsible for planning, economic development, and historic preservation for 27 years. Later, he led the age-friendly community program for AARP in Maine. He earned a graduate certificate in museum studies and a master's degree in planning and public policy at Tufts University, and is a graduate of the University of Southern Maine. Peter, thank you so much for being here to do this program with us.
Thank you. Kathleen chose the date for this program. I told her a couple of days I couldn't make it. And it just happens that on November 8th, 1855, L. Eaton Emerson made the last entry in his diary.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, 156th anniversary of the end of his diary. We'll talk a little bit about that. It's unclear why it ends.
Wow, what a coincidence.
And he'd been performing this panorama of California for 2 months in northern New England and in southern Quebec. He was 30 years old when he set out from Lewiston on September 11th, 1855. Not a lot of Maine ties as far as I've been able to determine. I know he performed 2 years earlier in Saco, found a newspaper clip related to that. But other than that and leaving from Lewiston and him knowing somebody from Green, Maine, I haven't found too many Maine connections. So the panorama he performed, he'd owned at least a couple of years. It depicted the California gold rush and the ocean voyage to get there. He drove a 2-horse wagon over very rough terrain, as you'll hear, from one tiny village to the next tiny village in the White Mountains and beyond, a 500-mile trip. He traveled 4 to 40 miles each day and performed the panorama 48 times in 60 days, but not on Sundays. Here's a little map. Oh, come on. Here we go. Here's a map that shows his route, leaving from Lewiston on the right and going up into New Hampshire nearly to the border, then over to Vermont and up across the border. He called a portion of his diary the exhibitor's life, as you can see here where the blue arrow is. And he said it was from L.E. Emerson of Lewiston Falls, Maine. I've noticed since I started researching this that occasionally Lewiston is referred to as Lewiston Falls then. So this is a diary that's in the Maine Historical Society library. It sheds a lot of light on entertainment in small rural places, tells us a lot about how moving panoramas were performed, and it tells a lot about the life of the small time traveling showman. With the help of this diary and a few other sources we've developed, we'll talk a bit about what a panorama is, talk about panoramas in Maine. We'll talk about Emerson's life as a traveling showman. in other parts of his life, what little we've been able to learn, and how this panorama was presented and what we know about the California imagery. First, a bit of background on panoramas. They are large paintings on fabric. There's two kinds. The earlier kind was developed in 1897 by a Scot, and it's the circular panorama, sometimes called a cyclorama here in America. They became a worldwide phenomenon in large cities everywhere. You may have seen one. The three accessible ones are the two Civil War panoramas in Atlanta or at Gettysburg, both subject to recent restoration, conservation. And a third one that's very nearby is at St. Anne de Beaupré. I think it's called Jerusalem at the Moment of Christ's Death. It's been closed for a number of years and unclear what's going to happen with it. I think the cultural ministry in Quebec has asserted something that will keep it there if not open for the time being. So in this kind of panorama, the visitor walks under the painting and up onto a platform where he's surrounded by this circular painting. And in fact, the word panorama is an invented word. It means all-encompassing view. And they were shown in purpose-built buildings in large cities. Later in US and UK, in the UK especially, they were elsewhere too, but mostly in our two English-speaking countries, the moving panorama developed. These are large paintings on fabric, usually muslin, that move across a stage at the front of the room with music sometimes, not this California panorama, and a lecturer bringing the picture alive. They range from parlor entertainments to major productions, like the Pilgrims Progress panorama at the Saco Museum. It was created in the early 1850s. It's 8 feet high and over 1,000 feet long. You may remember this image, which was used in a lot of publicity for the exhibition. The Pilgrim's Progress panorama is unlike many of the others in that it had some seriously trained artists involved. A couple of academicians painted it, and two first-rate Hudson River School artists, Frederick Edwin Church and Jasper Cropsey, actually contributed designs. But most of the panoramas were not ambitious. When we rediscovered the Pilgrim's Progress panorama 25 years ago, there was very little information. Our curator at the time, Tom Hardiman, developed a lot of information. By the way, one of the issues is that most of them are lost. There's only, maybe 20 extant. And then later, our museum director, Jessica Squire Ruthier, led a major conservation effort. That's not Jessica, that's a conservation lab in Massachusetts, putting some consolidant on the paper, the fabric. This is only 1/4 of the panorama. It was all conserved. Another moving panorama that you might know is the whaling panorama at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Pieces of that have been shown over the years. And then 3 years ago, they did a major restoration conservation program. And like we did in Saco, they presented the whole panorama in a mill. I'm not sure, I think theirs was like 700 feet long. These traveling panoramas often told stories of faraway places, especially if they had some linear aspect. Mississippi River panoramas were among the most popular. Here's a couple of New Bedford images before I forget. This is in the mill, the New Bedford whaling panorama displayed in the mill at the lower end of the main street in New Bedford 3 years ago. Some of the panoramas were topical, like the California panorama that Emerson showed. It was in large part a gold rush panorama and a westward expansion panorama. These were incredibly popular. You couldn't go through a week's newspapers without seeing something about panoramas in any large town in Maine. I've looked at Augusta papers, Bedford papers, Saco papers, Portland papers. That's in all of them. By the way, there's one other panorama. Yeah, here's an image of it on a little smaller scale, but still large. It's a panorama of Rockland, the main street and the waterfront. And it's on exhibit right now at the Farnsworth on the 6th level if you want to see it. The moving panoramas had the advantage of being movable, transportable, and could be shown in any small hall, theater, classrooms, churches. How were they shown? Let's look at some illustrations to discuss that a little bit. These are the reels from the Pilgrims Progress panorama at the Saco Museum. And I don't think they're complete, and it's a little dark on the end, but there's a gear at the left end of that dark disc. Part of our project at the Saco Museum was to create a replica, a full-size printed panorama on fabric. And we had panorama shows with that replica, but this is the scale of the apparatus that we had to build to move that and keep it in a plane. I'll have some other images on that. This is a performance in Saco, what was it, 6 or 7 years ago. Great piano player, normally plays for silent movies, named Jeff Rapsis. He plays in the Gunkwit each summer for silent movies. A Magic Lantern performer happened to be with us that night, and he did the performance. This is a image of a historic performer in front of what looks to be a racist panorama. And here's another example of how a performance might have looked. The Arctic was a popular subject, and mountains in general. That looks like it's called Birch's Holiday Trip. I'm not familiar with what panorama this is, but getting to the diary, Bill Barry, who used to be at the library at Maine Historical in 1997, sent to Tom Hardiman, who was our curator at the time, a photocopy of this Emerson diary. It's a fascinating thing. I've been meaning to write something about it for decades and finally did for the International Panorama Conference in September. I'm sorry, I just got rattled by a little notice on my screen that my internet connection is unstable. Recently, we were able to obtain from the Bancroft Library at the University of California a descriptive catalog, which was distributed at shows in 1853. It's unclear where the shows were. This is especially useful when you compare it to the script that's in the diary. Previously, we had only the cover. Now we have the 8-page brochure, or as they were called, exhibition catalog. Emerson's life was a complete mystery until August, when I noticed a Library of Congress entry, L.E. Emerson correspondence. The letter proved that when he said in his narration of this panorama, I saw, that he had actually been to California and seen many of the things he described. The letter, that's not always the case. Panoramas were frequently sold and new performers performed them with old scripts. From the letter, we learned that Emerson left Boston on a small ship called the Albatross on September 3rd, 1849. And then 180 days later, on February 15th, 1850, he arrived in San Francisco Harbor. And while he was waiting to disembark, he wrote this letter that we found. It's very interesting. This is, the beginning of the gold rush. I thank God I am here. This is the most delightful harbor, and plenty of game can be scared up in this bay. Plenty of wild cattle can be seen grazing on the hills. Everything looks green and flourishing. There's some snow on the tops of the mountains. How much a man can make at the mines, I know not, but the rush is on for the diggings. That I am sure. We made the passages in 180 days and got beat by everything that carried a topsail. Yeah, it was a small boat apparently without a lot of cloth. His father Abraham traveled with him and died in Sacramento 8 months later on November 5th. Did that cause Emerson to return quite quickly? The letter and his father's name led to family records. He was born in 1825 in South Reading, now Wakefield, Mass., 30 miles north of Boston. He died in Franklin, New Hampshire in 1864 of heart disease. He does not seem to have been in Maine for more than a few years. His occupation at the end of life was agent. Was he still in entertainment? His birth and death records led to another discovery. Why was it always L. Eaton Emerson or L.E. Emerson? No first name ever. These records have his first name as Lilly, L-I-L-L-E-Y, an old family name. Never used it. The young man may not have liked to be called Lilly. The 1850 census listed him as a writing master or penmanship teacher, as we would say, which explains why I could so readily read his diary and letters, and perhaps some of the decoration, as you can see in the image behind me. Emerson called the panorama several names: the Panorama of California, Emerson Celebrating California Paintings, A Glimpse of the Golden Land, The Grand Moving Mirror. It was painted by two Boston area artists. We know very little about them. He names them in his diary, as you can see 2/3 of the way down the page here. One was Thomas Badger, born 1820. His better known father was Thomas Badger, born in 1792. He's a bit more noted painter. And by Frederick Thomas Somerby, who was born in 1814. Both were portrait painters and decorative painters near where Emerson had lived. Let me see. He purchased the Panorama in 1854, or perhaps a half interest. An organ was included, but it's not mentioned again, nor is there mention of music with the show. The diary book has three major parts: the diary itself, a script. Here's some of the script, and we'll get to the third part. There's a long introduction in the script. The third part was a phrenology lecture. He apparently performed a phrenology lecture, which we won't say too much more about, but phrenology, as you know, is studying the head in a way that's, very much like a palm reader. He drove west from Lewiston to the town of Freiburg, about 50 miles, and performed his first show on September 12th. The house was overflowing, he wrote. He took in $5.50 with expenses of $2.25. Maybe it looks something like this as he wrote along. This is from a book called Knocking About, which includes a panorama show. The second night was at Freiburg Center, another of the town's three villages, where we, quote, set up our canvas in the townhouse. Emerson mocks his own presentation, saying, we blew gas for an hour and a half to the satisfaction of the ticket purchases. He took in $5.44 for an audience of 50. So ticket prices were about 12 cents, which is the same number that's in that brochure. The 2-month tour records proceeds of $274 and expenses of $176. So it was a modest financial success. The brochure includes 4 press clippings from 2 years earlier for the 1853 shows, praising the Panorama. The one I was able to find was from the Saco Mercantile Advertiser in 1853. The exhibition of Emerson's panoramic views of California was full of interest and instruction, the newspaper wrote. The paintings were exceedingly well executed and gave a lifelike representation. Views of principal cities, mining, many other scenes connected with California life, and were well attended. The final phrase, as you can see here, was not "were well intended." He was always puffing the show. He added that to the newspaper account. There's little press related to the 1853 tour. Other California panoramas got lots of press. I found clippings related to at least 20 others. Here's a bunch of broadsides related to them. And here's a list of 20 other California panoramas. Newspapers in the 1850s portray a nation that was fascinated by California and the gold rush. There were daily articles from faraway correspondents, shipping news, letters from local, tales of wealth, manifest destiny was in the air as well. On the 14th of September, he went to North Freiburg, and he, quote, unrolled at the Universalist Chapel. It's still there, although the church is really across the street now. This is still there. And we did not make our pile here, he wrote. Well, it's not very centrally located. Let's take a look. Here's a little video of just where this chapel was. And I'm going to talk a little about raising an audience in a remote area like this. It's not quite sure how he did it. Here's a couple of the more substantial buildings that he performed in. The next night, there was another performance in Maine, 4 miles to the north in the town of Stowe, where the White Mountains really begin. After the show, he heard some specimen of tall fiddling by Mr. Job Thornton. When the pandemic receded this spring, our first outing was a car trip visiting many of these towns, and these photographs and some of the others that you see. We did 300 miles of Emerson's 500-mile trip and photographed 6 of these halls. The size of the towns is 400 to 800, 400 to 2,800 in population. Emerson in some towns performed 2 or 3 in 2 or 3 smaller villages. For instance, Freiburg had 3 performances in 3 villages, and there's only 1,500 people in the entire town. That's a difficult math to raise an audience. How did he handle showing the panorama? There are a few details to help understand the apparatus. In his October 7th entry, Emerson said he engaged the town hall to set up our machine. Could he crank it by himself? I'm not sure. It's very difficult to handle a full-size panorama. In his diary, he shows what looks like a piece of apparatus, and he has a tally of $227 by 3 tradesmen to build it, which one source says would have been about $9,000, which seems very, very high. There's 26 scenes in the panorama, and the narrowest scenes in Pilgrim's Progress, for example, and that's from the same time, are 15 feet wide. So his panorama, if it's anywhere near that side would be about 390 feet long. In October 19th, Emerson writes, "I started out on foot as our horses are giving out. Our carriage is too heavy for them, refined by sad experiences. The horses had to be shoed several times. And it was raining most days in early October, and the mountain roads were very bad. On October 27th and 28th, there was snow about a month before it usually does. In the long, hard winter of 1855, 1856 is quite well documented. Here's another little clip from our post-pandemic trip. Emerson was nearing the end of his travels when he performed at this brick church in just west and north of St. Johnsbury. The hall was, the church was actually abandoned at the time he performed and was later renovated to become a Masonic temple, which it still is. It's another Vermont hall. The diary entries grew shorter. On November 2nd, there was a melancholy entry, "Dark and low my evening. Bad weather, bad travel conditions, and failing horses may explain his sudden ending of his tour, or his diary, at least, on November 9th, November 8th, actually. Here's an entry for November 8th and just the date, November 9th, ready for the next entry, but there was none. After 2 months of daily accounts, who knows what happened? Town halls and churches were typical venues for the performance. There's references to buying handbills from printers and distributing them. At times it went badly. A minister saw Emerson's handbill about a scene called Black Diamonds, which may have been a racist sketch. There's a couple of scholars that think that. You'll find them in a list of sources I've got. So he was not allowed to use this church. He wrote, "At the close of school, the minister cautioned his pupils against the demoralizing influence of panoramas in general, and this one of California in particular." On October 23rd, in Walcott, Vermont, people didn't fancy the show at all, Emerson writes. This is a really interesting thing for researchers into 19th century entertainment. Why didn't people enjoy the show? Mr. J.E. Sawyer of Green was here last Thursday with his Magic Lantern show. Visual entertainment was evolving everywhere. The most frequently itemized expense was camphine, which is sometimes called burning fluid. It's, this show was in September, October, and into November, so we had to light the halls every evening. Camphine is little known. It was the most commonly used, at least in the eastern United States, an inexpensive fuel for lamps from 1840 to 1860. And it produced some really good light economically. It was, however, based on an incredible brutal treatment of enslaved workers. And I'm running long, and we're going to have to skip that. This is an example of how it was done. The resin would run down into a carved out place in the tree. These are camphine lamps, which are very much like kerosene lamps, but they have 2 wicks. They were quite dangerous because it's a low burning point. This is a nice book about this whole subject. This is Tom Hanks in a recent movie, News of the World. And I can imagine the shows in some of these small halls might have looked a bit like this. It's a list of the scenes in the panorama, in the diary. The performance script, when typed up, is 12 pages, single spaced. 26 scenes are described. The script is mostly quite didactic, but it does have some breaks for drama and humor. It opens strangely with what was to become the seal of the state of California. He attributes this to a writer named Bayard Taylor. And the second scene is a map to orient the audience. He attributes a couple of his scenes to Bayard Taylor. And by the way, I didn't know anything of him, but he was a very, very good writer. This is quite a readable book, and he wrote many others. And but he didn't just write. He also produced drawings and prints of these California gold rush sites. And here's 4 of them. And this one's called the Volcano Diggings, which is actually a mining site. They derived their name from the peculiar appearance of the hills and soil, and from a crater or a crag. That may be seen on the left. On the top of the crater, embedded in the rock, is a large oak tree, and as it is plainly visible. That's from the script. San Francisco script is on this page, and here's the Taylor illustration of San Francisco Harbor, not too long from when Emerson had arrived there. It was incredibly busy. A lot of these boats are actually abandoned, you read, if you read this. Leaving beside the specific imagery, you can learn about the nature of the performance with Emerson's directions to the audience. He would say things like, in the foreground, you will notice at the left can be seen. The point on the right is Port Lobos. At the right are a couple of ladies. They were scarce commodities in this country at this time. We give you a view of the miners at work. So he had to direct the audience, tell the audience what they were looking at. So this script, a few years ago, 15 years ago, we sent it to a young woman artist in California, in Los Angeles, Sarah Vilas, who actually produced a panorama once, about 5 feet high. And this is, again, San Francisco Harbor, for a performance that they've done many times since at her Panorama Theater in Los Angeles. The last scene is set to portray a grizzly bear, which is a symbol of California. And then in this text, Emerson tells the audience, I tender you my thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind and respectful attention. We will now consider the exhibition closed. I don't know if you took questions in 1855, but I'll be glad to drop my script and discuss the diary with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. That was really interesting. And folks, if you have questions for Peter, you can put them into the chat or into the Q&A. Forgive me, Peter, if you mentioned this and I just missed it, but how did Emerson come to a job like this? So it sounds like he's not the artist of that panorama, but did he commission it, or did someone else commission it and hire him to write a script and take it around? Like, how does one have a career, come to a career like this?
Yeah, there's a bunch of information. It doesn't all add up. Panoramas were bought and sold all the time, on the one hand. The diary has a reference to him either buying out a partner or buying the panorama outright. It's hard to tell which, or buying a partnership in a panorama. It's unclear exactly what he's doing. The thing that makes me think that he might have had something to do with its origin is that these 2 painters that I mentioned are one of them's from the same part of Massachusetts that he was from. And they're basically the North Shore. The other is Boston area as well. And perhaps he had something to do with those. And I think one of them might have even been a family relation.
One question from our audience. What was the average cost to view a panorama?
the average cost to view this panorama seems to be 12 or 12.5 cents. Don't know what tickets were for other panoramas. I know this one was 12.5 cents for both the show that we've described in 1855 and the 1853 show. Maybe they got a premium for bigger shows like Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress was a huge thing. The one that we have at the Saco Museum is actually a second edition. There were two of them circulating, and the second edition survives, and it sold hundreds of thousands of tickets, 500,000 in New York, I think I remember.
Did you ever go and see, so these, when, I mean, in the 1800s, when you go to see like one of these shows, there, you know, there's a narrator like Emerson, and the panorama is being spooled. But did folks ever have an opportunity to see them the way they're often displayed in museums today, like just the whole thing out on display? No.
And with rare exceptions, it really was not to look at a painting. It was to look at a show that was, I mean, and most of these had music. There was no way for him to work out music in the country like this, but very much like a silent film. They'd go from frame to frame, you know, somewhere between 20 and 50 frames. And the piano player and the professor made it come alive.
So how did you come to Emerson's diary? Was this like through your work with the Pilgrims Progress at the Saco Museum, or?
Yeah, Bill Barry sent it to Tom Hardiman, and it informed our work on Pilgrim's Progress a little bit, but it was, I always thought there might be more to excavate, and so last year during the pandemic, it was a project I could do at home.
Right.
And so I did.
Couple other questions from our audience. How long would a show like this last? Like, is it like an hour or maybe a little bit less?
Well, wouldn't you know, as I was cutting out a page or two, that was, I think I somehow did some math that made me think that this is about 90 minutes. The scenes seemed to be 2.5 to 4 minutes. Somewhere it said 90 minutes, and you can tell from the script that some of the scenes have much more talk around them than others. So each scene was 2 to 4 minutes for a total of 90 minutes.
Okay. Were these child-friendly events, and were they events where folks would get dressed up and like think of it, this is like some kind of social outing?
Definitely a social outing. Dressed up, I don't know. I mean, we're talking 6 nights a week in these little towns in the White Mountains and in the Green Mountains, and by the way, that last November 8th entry was for Coaticook in southern Quebec. Don't know much about children. Must be because the minister was particularly discouraging the school children, and certainly they were welcomed elsewhere.
I mean, so if we think about maybe something like the cost, like 12 cents, would that have been doable for parents to take their kids to, or is that so prohibitive that they might say, oh, you know, this is just for mom and dad to go to?
Now that you've asked, I remember in that published brochure, which was distributed with the 1853 performances, there was a lower price, I think half price for children.
Oh, okay. Very good. I had another question myself and now it's escaping me. Oh, so we were talking about like the connections of this diary and this story to Maine. And it certainly, you know, Emerson leaves from Lewiston, and it sounds like he's traveling all over the country, but that would include some parts of New England and Canada. But I also know that Maine, I think, has some connections to like the California gold rush itself. Do you know anything about that?
Well, not a lot, but when other parts of that letter from the harbor, San Francisco Harbor, he talks about different captains that he and his father knew in the harbor, although it seemed more Boston oriented than Maine oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know.
Okay. If people, so can you talk just maybe a little bit more about your research on a project like this? I mean, certainly a lot of it would, I imagine, center around the diary itself, but where else do you go to get information?
Well, this was a particularly tough research project, to tell you the truth. There's very little source. That letter that, after months of looking, I just happened to notice something in the Library of Congress catalog, that letter from San Francisco Harbor. And that opened up a number of doors. Something that I was pretty unfamiliar with is people researching their family histories, their genealogy, post these elaborate trees on the internet these days. The last time I looked at genealogy, that stuff didn't exist, but they're really elaborate. And a couple of Google searches of those kinds of sites, and I started to find, some information about him and his family, some family names. I didn't mention it, but the back cover, or the inside back cover, has the name of the donor to the society, and I think it was in the 60s. And that family name appears way back in the 19th century as well. So that diary came down through a family before it went to you all. The exhibition catalog or brochure that we got from the University of California Library was very helpful. Comparisons between the two, internal text analysis. What I didn't find is, and what you usually do on projects like this, is you look in the Lewiston City Directory, you look in all kinds of places.
Right.
There's very little trace of this guy in Maine.
Wow. So we don't know. I mean, after November 8th, 1850 something, do we know what happened to him, or?
Till he died of heart disease in Franklin, New Hampshire in 64, I think I said. Not much in between.
Yeah.
His profession is listed as agent. Agent can mean a lot of things, but could be in entertainment.
And do we know what happened to the panorama itself?
We sure don't.
No.
But that's not unusual.
Yeah.
I think there's 21 moving panoramas in the United States that still exist, and I shouldn't say that. I'm talking about ones from this historic period that are full size. There's lots of different moving panoramas. There's an interesting one of Garibaldi in the Brown University Library. There's this smallish one in Rockland that's very good, but there's very few. There's stories of them wearing out, being used for draperies, being pieced apart. For a long time at one of the museums in New York, there was a piece showing New York Harbor behind the desk from a larger panorama. Wow. The fabric was repainted. And think about how they were used. If you're showing a panorama every night, you have paint on usually muslin, and it's rolling, unrolling. It gets a lot of rough treatment.
A lot of wear and tear. And yeah.
Paint doesn't adhere well. They've almost always, the two that I know well, the Pilgrims Progress and the Whaling Panorama, both have all kinds of infill cloth, infill painting.
Yeah, and I mean, they're getting pulled off and on of ships and wagons and in and out of
Yeah.
buildings. And I imagine too, I mean, now looking back, these are rare, precious, interesting objects that, of historical value and of a bygone time. But there was probably a time too that, with the advent of photography and movies, this kind of becomes like what someone like myself did with, VHS and cassette tapes, like, 10, 20 years ago. Nobody uses these anymore, or just get rid of them. This is old, this is outdated, who cares?
It was very out of fashion. The magic lantern shows and other entertainments, later movies. You can find this in literature in the early 20th century. They were a dim memory. When we started our research in 1997, all that Tom and I and the others were able to find was this series of articles by a man named Joseph Arrington, who had written about probably a dozen different panoramas, 8 or 10 different panoramas anyway, in little historical magazines, quarterlies around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one, and there was a couple of chapters in one book from Germany and one book from the UK, but very little beyond that.
Yeah.
In fact, this seems like a good time to actually advance, if I can. Whoops. This is a list of other sources here that will answer some of these questions.
Yeah, and I shared some of these in the links, like as you were mentioning. In the chat rather. I shared some of these links kind of as you were mentioning them. But if anybody missed those, you can check out this list now.
And one of the things I should mention here is this is a little obscure, but this next to the last book here, Literary Dollars and Social Sense. As far as I know, this is the only other scholars. These are the only other scholars in 2005. Somehow they saw Emerson's diary and wrote about this Black Diamonds scene. Then the last book by Erkki Huhtamo, that he's the leading scholar of moving panoramas, and there's not many of us. And he wrote an incredible book length. A book, I should say, that does mention this diary. Beyond that, there's very, very little has been used.
One more question from the audience while folks are kind of taking in this great list of resources. And this question's about Emerson. Do you know what do you know about his family? Was he married? Did you have any of that information?
I know that his diary records getting news about Jenny. Don't know whether Jenny was his wife or his girlfriend. I suspect his girlfriend because it kind of disappears in time. I don't know. I did not pursue, because I learned it so late, I did not pursue the Franklin, New Hampshire connection. Maybe some research
like why he ended up there
would tell something.
Yeah.
On the one hand. On the other hand, New Hampshire had very few newspapers. These small towns did not have town directories until a few years later. One of the directories kind of started 1860. So whether we could find anything or not. I should also say that, I'm not the kind of scholar who's going to write a book on this. I just had some fun doing this presentation, but there's a book to be had here if somebody
Sure.
wants to do one.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Well, thank you so much, Peter. This was a really interesting talk. I personally love hearing stories like these that come from Maine Historical Society's collection that I previously wasn't aware of. Who knew that this was living in our library and all of the interesting world of history that it was attached to. So thank you so much for sharing your this story and your expertise with us.
Thank you. And we will literally share with the library some files so that the next researcher won't start from zero.
Won't start from scratch. Yeah, that's great. Folks, if you are interested in learning more, if you're interested in doing research at the Maine Historical Library yourself, like Peter has done, or in visiting Maine Historical Society, or becoming a member, seeing other recorded programs like this one, visit mainehistory.org to find everything that you need. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Peter. Have a good evening.
I'm looking forward to the sinking of the Portland and the next.
That's our next one on the 17th. Yeah, November 17th. I hope folks can come back. We're going to talk about the story that's often referred to as New England's Titanic, the sinking of the Portland, which was another one. It's funny, you know, that this one just happens to be on the anniversary of the last entry in Emerson's diary. I wanted to do the sinking of the Portland on the anniversary of that happening, but it was just too close to where the holiday falls this year, Thanksgiving, that it didn't work out. But I hope that we'll see folks back for that. And again, just everybody, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.